on the same ship. So we must push one common intention. It's for a better life in the region. For we woman and we children. That must be the ambition of the Caribbean and the Caribbean and the Caribbean.
Hello and welcome to the Open Word podcast, my most recent, or should we say, my new intervention. Welcome to the Open Word. Why do they fear the open word? We will find out. Today, I want to deal with local government elections in Guyana. Of course, on April 17, there were nominations for local government elections slated for June 12th. There has been a lot of controversy over these elections. They were postponed several times because the architecture for the elections at GCOM did not allow for proper elections. In fact, the three commissioners nominated by the opposition have said that they do not believe that GCOM is ready for these elections. And so therefore, we are going in to elections without the confidence of all sides, all stakeholders. And so this puts us in quite a conundrum. For its part, the government seems enthusiastic, meaning the PPP, not the government. The PPP seems enthusiastic about these elections. The opposition, on the other hand, are ambivalent. The AFC, the Alliance for Change, and the WPA, the Working People's Alliance, two of what we call smaller parties, have said that they would boycott the elections, citing the biased nature of the architecture, in particular, the voters list, which continues to be a problem for both local government elections and general elections. The preference is a struggle for a better architecture, a fairer voters list, and mechanisms that are put in place to ensure the integrity of the elections. None of this has been agreed to by the PPP commissioners. And so therefore, the opposition commissioners are expressing no confidence in these elections. Now, as far as the opposition is concerned, the PNC, which is, for all intents and purposes, the major party in the APNU, has decided that they would go ahead and contest the elections in their strongholds, which are primarily the municipalities, Georgetown, Linden, New Amsterdam, Bartica. And they would contest the neighborhood councils also in those villages, those neighborhoods that are considered opposition stronghold. In effect, they are going to contest elections in the predominantly African Guyanese constituencies. In a sense, this is a protest participation. It's a participation not based on conviction that the elections would be free and fair, but it's a pragmatic decision to contest the elections. Now, if one looked at what happened on nomination day, it is very clear that the PPP is framing these elections as part of its quest to dominate Guyana. It has managed to get some people who defected from the PNC on its slate, especially in Georgetown. And so therefore, it is framing the contest as one in which it would basically overturn the dominance of the PNC in its traditional areas. Now, on the surface of things, this seems pretty normal. After all, parties contest elections to defeat their opponents. But there is more to these elections than defeat of the opponent. These elections, to my mind, are framed as part of the PPP's quest to dominate Guyana. And part of that quest includes neutralizing the African Guyanese community. And this neutralization takes at least three forms. On the one hand, to seek to recruit African Guyanese to the PPP's slates. Not so much to get them to bring votes, but to use the optics to embarrass the PNC. The second form of this quest for domination is to induce fear in the African Guyanese community. To say that if you don't join the PPP, you will not get opportunities in the country. And so this leads to the third part of the quest, and that is to use the enormous money that the government has at its disposal to bribe and to buy African Guyanese support. And this is on full show in these elections. The PPP has been able to showcase some African Guyanese on its local government slates. And I'm arguing here that a lot of those who appear on those slates, from what we've been hearing, have been bought. In fact, it's a saying now in Guyana that one of the easiest things to buy is an African Guyanese. And so therefore, these elections have to be seen against that background. How then will the opposition move? In my view, the next 2 months on the election campaign trail, it should be a period in which the opposition must do 2 things simultaneously. They must use the campaign to continue the struggle for electoral integrity, to continue the struggle to democratize GCOM, continue the struggle for a clean voters list, a list that does not include people who are not eligible to vote. It must be a struggle, a continued struggle for checks and balances at GCOM. Things like biometrics and all the other suggestions that are being made to ensure the integrity of the process. Already the opposition is dealing with the fact that the PPP, has used its majority at GCOM, that is the 3 commissioners plus the chairperson, to ensure that the leading personnel at GCOM are partial to the PPP. Currently, the CEO, the deputy CEO, the assistant CEO are all persons who, from all indications, are partial to the PPP. And they're in positions to then influence the hiring of people lower down in the GCOM secretariat. So the PPP has hijacked GCOM and therefore hijack the management of elections. That is a critical area. Because as we have seen from the recount of the 2020 elections, that serious damage to the integrity of elections are done long before election day. And key to that would be the GCOM staff. So this election campaign, this local government election campaign, should be used as a form of struggle for free and fair elections in Guyana, and for elections that are free from fear. Secondly, the election campaign must be used as a means of stopping the PPP from taking total control of African Guyanese communities. What that means is there must be a way to merge the boycott call by the AFC and the WPA with the participation in the elections of the APNU. They have to merge those 2 approaches rather than to have divergent approaches. we cannot afford for the boycott call from the PPP, the AFC and the WPA. Their boycott call should not give comfort to the PPP. Their boycott calls should not facilitate the PPP's intent to control African Guyanese communities, and by extension, African Guyanese. And so the boycott call by the FC and the WPA must take on new dimensions. Those boycott calls, in the context of what the PPP intends to use these elections for, should not help to facilitate the PPP's quest for domination. The AFC and WPA should not find themselves in a position where they are urging supporters of the opposition to stay away from the poll when the major opposition party is contesting. I'm not here advocating that the boycott should be called off. I'm arguing that the boycott should continue as far as the parties are concerned. But the boycott must now take on the form of resistance. Resistance both against a flawed voters list, but resistance against PPP's domination also. It's a delicate balance, but it has to be accomplished. The AFC and WPA cannot afford to find themselves in a position where their strategy, their boycott strategy, helps the PPP to assume dominance and control. That is what I'm arguing here. The PNC, on the other hand, the APNU, should not frame its participation in the elections as its endorsement of GCOM's architecture, of the election architecture. It has to frame its message that participation is a form of protest. Listen to me carefully. Participation in the elections should be a form of protest, bringing then the opposition together, meaning the APNU, the AFC, and the WPA. Let me repeat. The boycott should not be a boycott that calls on supporters of the opposition to not go to the polls. If opposition supporters are going to the polls, it must be framed in the context of protest. They're going to the polls to cast a protest vote. And I think that is the way, that has to be the approach. I, of course, am in support of not participating in crooked elections. But I am also not in support of PPP's control and domination. So as I said, one has to merge the two approaches. The ball is in the opposition court. We know that there are court cases challenging GCOM. Well, court case. That is the case involving Sister Carol Joseph. That case, I think, is going to be heard sometime in May. And the outcome of that case could have some bearing on the elections. So there is that. But if the elections are to go ahead on June 12th, it has to be done from the opposition standpoint in a strategic way. It has to be an election in which opposition supporters go out to the polls and cast a protest vote. The WPA has called for a day of protest and uprising. The challenge now is for the WPA to frame that day of protest and uprising within the context of this new development. It is clear, it is very clear that the PPP intends to use these elections as part of its grand design of neutralizing, embarrassing, and disrespecting African Guyanese. That changes everything. And so opposition parties cannot be seen to be telling opposition supporters not to go to the polls. It is a challenge, but these challenges have to be navigated. We're not dealing with a normal situation. We're not dealing with a normal situation. And so we have to be as creative as possible. The first option should always be that there should be no elections until the machinery is clean and agreed to by all sides. The second option, of course, is the option chosen by the APNU/PNC, and that is to participate partially in the elections, not as an endorsement of the electoral machinery, but as a pragmatic approach, political pragmatism. And so that is the challenge. The ball, as I said, is in the opposition's court. It is clear, I am very clear in my mind that those candidates who defected from the PNC and have gone over to the PPP are not going to cause the PNC/APNU to lose votes. But their importance is the optics that are being presented. And so, therefore, that has to be challenged. Local government elections generally do not draw large turnouts. It is obvious that the PPP has mobilized its constituency. And the challenge now for the opposition is to mobilize their constituency. It's clear. It's not the best option. But from a pragmatic standpoint, the opposition has to get its constituency to the polls. There is no other way. And the boycott by the two opposition parties should not stand in the way of that mobilization. I think that the three parties need to meet, sit down, and coordinate. The WPA is on the road holding public meetings. What should be its stance at those public meetings? I have given you my view. The AFC seems not to be actively speaking about these elections. Must it remain silent? How would that silence be interpreted by supporters? The three parties must meet and work out a clear strategy if their objectives are the same. If their objectives are the same. And I rather suspect that their objectives are the same. That they all want a clean machinery. Ultimately, they differ on the approach. The PNC/APNU are of the view that you have to take a pragmatic approach and participate partially. The others feel that you should stay out totally. They have to sit down as opposition parties and work out a common strategy. That's the open word for today. That's the open word for today. Let's hope that the opposition parties pay close attention to what is going on and realize this is not just another election. This is part of the larger strategy of the PPP to dominate and to control.
One race from the same place that make the same grip on the